In a Ashwood County Courthouse bathed in flickering fluorescent light, a death sentence lands like a fatal blow, yet the accused man's eyes burn with an unbelievable truth. Miles away at a deserted dock shrouded in shadow, a growling dog stands over something buried, a clue pointing to the real killer. Who will this mystery drag into the light, and who will it bury forever? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. Let's get into it. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the crowded Ashwood County Courthouse, casting stark shadows over Ethan Carver's face as he sat rigidly in the defendant's chair. His fingers dug into the wooden armrests, knuckles turning white. Years of police training did little to steady his pounding heart. The jury filed in, their expressions carefully neutral, avoiding his gaze. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Eliottis's voice cut through the heavy silence. We have, Your Honor. The jury foreman rose, his hands trembling slightly as he held the verdict slip. Ethan's sharp eyes darted around the room, absorbing every detail, instincts kicking in just as he'd been trained. His attorney, Nathan Wells, sat hunched over his notepad, shoulders sagging in quiet resignation. Across the aisle, District Attorney Peterson allowed himself the barest hint of a smile. In the back row, Lila Harper remained motionless, her expression unreadable. She had been his partner for 5 years, yet now she felt like a stranger. In the case of the state versus Ethan Carver, on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. The words struck Ethan like a physical blow. A murmur spread through the Ashwood County Courthouse like a slow-moving wave. The jury recommends death by lethal injection, the foreman continued, his voice unsteady. Ethan clenched his jaw, his teeth grinding under the pressure. His mind raced through the damning evidence. The gunshot residue on his hands, the grainy footage of a man resembling him entering Grayson's apartment. The witness who swore she saw him that night. It was all too perfect, too airtight. But he knew the truth. He hadn't killed Miles Grayson. The bailiffs moved in with handcuffs. Ethan rose, his legs heavy, like they no longer belonged to him. As they led him toward the door, his eyes locked onto Lila's. She sat straight-backed, unmoving. But for the briefest moment, something flickered across her face. Doubt, regret. Outside the courthouse, Rex waited with his temporary handler. The German shepherd's ears perked at the sound of the heavy door swinging open. The moment Ethan stepped out in cuffs, Rex tensed. A sharp bark tore from his throat, his body straining against the leash with such force that the handler stumbled. Easy, boy, the handler murmured, struggling to maintain control. But Rex barked again, louder, more frantic, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. Ethan didn't look back. He couldn't. The van doors slammed shut behind him. That night, lying on the thin iron hollow penitentiary mattress, he stared at the G-jack ceiling of his cell, the weight of his fate pressing down on him. Death row. He was going to die for a crime he didn't commit. Across town, Lila unlocked her apartment door, Rex trotting in behind her. She told herself it was temporary, just until another arrangement was made. But Rex had other ideas. He paced between the door and the window, nails clicking against the hardwood, pausing every few minutes to whine and glance at her with pleading eyes. He's not coming back, boy, she whispered. But Rex didn't stop. He resumed his pacing, waiting for a master who would never return. The metal door of cell 2187 slammed shut with a hollow clang, the sound reverberating through Ethan's bones. The walls felt smaller, the air heavier, as the reality of his new world settled in. Bare concrete walls, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, and a stainless steel toilet sink combination that looked like it had seen better days. No window, just artificial light that buzzed overhead, constant and unforgiving. "Welcome home, pig," someone shouted from down the block, followed by cruel laughter and more taunts. The voices blended into a distant hum as Ethan stood motionless in the center of his cell. His fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. This was death row, his new reality. Hours passed like molasses. A guard appeared with a plastic food, T-Jack, sliding it through the slot without a word. Ethan stared at the G-Jack mass that was supposed to be meatloaf, the lumpy potatoes, the wilted vegetables. His stomach turned. He pushed the T-Jack aside and sat on his cot, staring at the blank wall. His attorney would file an appeal. That's what they all did. But Ethan knew the statistics. Death row appeals rarely succeeded. The thought hit him like a physical blow. He might actually die here, strapped to a table with poison in his veins, for a murder he didn't commit. Across town, Lila watched Rex pace her apartment for the third straight hour. His food bowl sat untouched, water barely touched. The German Shepherd's nails clicked against her hardwood floors as he moved from the door to the window and back again, letting out occasional whines that broke her heart. "Come on, boy," she finally said, grabbing his leash. "Let's get some air." Rex perked up at the sight of the leash, but as soon as they hit the sidewalk, he had his own agenda. He pulled hard, nearly yanking the leash from her grip, heading determinedly toward the waterfront. "Rex, heel!" she commanded, but the dog ignored her. They hadn't been to the docks in months, not since that last case she'd worked with Ethan. Rex dragged her past the warehouses, his nose working overtime, moving with such urgency that it made her uneasy. This wasn't just a dog following old patrol routes. This was something else. In his cell, Ethan lay on his back, staring at the ceiling as his mind replayed that final day of freedom. He'd been following leads on Miles Grayson's murder, checking security footage from nearby businesses. Something about the timing hadn't added up. Then suddenly SWAT had surrounded him, weapons drawn. No warning, no explanation, just cuffs and custody. He turned on his side, the thin mattress offering little comfort. None of it made sense. The evidence against him had appeared out of nowhere, perfectly packaged and completely damning. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to put him here. The question that kept him awake wasn't whether he'd been framed. He knew he had been. The real questions were who had done this to him and why they wanted him to take the fall so badly. The first jacks of dawn hadn't yet touched the sky when Lila jolted awake to Rex's persistent whining. She rolled over in bed, squinting at the 4:37 a.m. The German Shepherd stood by her bedside, his tail low, making that same distressed sound that had become all too familiar over the past 2 days. "Rex, please," she mumbled, running a hand over her face. But the dog wouldn't settle. He paced between her bed and the door, his nails clicking against the floor with increasing urgency. Lila threw back her covers with a sigh. "Fine, you win." She pulled on her jacket over her pajamas and grabbed his leash. Rex practically dragged her down the 3 flights of stairs to the street. The city was eerily quiet at this hour, with only the occasional delivery truck rumbling past. Rex pulled hard on his leash, heading straight for the waterfront again. Lila's feet dragged as she followed, the cold morning air biting at her cheeks. "What is it with you and the docks lately?" she asked. But Rex ignored her, his nose working overtime as he led her past the chain-link fence and into the industrial area. They stopped near an abandoned warehouse, its windows broken and walls covered in graffiti. Rex circled a specific spot near the loading dock, sniffing intently at the ground. Lila watched him, puzzled by his focused behavior. Then something caught her eye, a small piece of fabric partially buried in the dirt. Crouching down, she carefully picked it up. The material was rough and thick, with charred edges that crumbled at her touch. It felt familiar somehow, like the heavy-duty uniform material used in police gear. Later that night, Lila spread the crime scene photos across her Kit Hayes table. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago as she studied every detail. Miles Grayson's body had been found wearing a dark jacket, but it was clearly civilian clothing, nothing like the burnt scrap she'd found. She held the fabric up to the light. The weave was distinctive, industrial grade, exactly like the material used in police tactical gear. Her heart beat faster as the implications started to sink in. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was her friend Vincent, a court clerk who owed her a favor. "Got that update you wanted," he said, handing her a manila envelope. Ethan's appeal was denied this morning. Across town in his cell, Ethan sat perfectly still as his attorney delivered the same news. The lawyer's words washed over him like white noise, technical terms about procedural issues and insufficient grounds for appeal. "We knew this might happen," the attorney said carefully, "but this is just the first step. We can file dash. Save it, Ethan cut him off. We both know how this goes. His voice was steady, bet-jacking none of the anger churning inside him. He'd expected this outcome. It was all part of the game. Whoever had set him up had done their homework. Back in her apartment, Lila turned the scrap of fabric over and over in her hands. Taking this to the department would be useless. They'd closed ranks the moment Ethan was arrested. The case was closed, filed away, forgotten. Rex lay at her feet, his ears suddenly perking up. A low growl rumbled in his chest as she examined the burnt cloth again. Something about this piece of evidence made her skin crawl. Something was very, very wrong here. The morning air was thick with fog as Lila pulled into the empty racing lot near the docks. Rex sat in the passenger seat, his ears forward, completely focused. This time she came prepared with an evidence collection kit she'd kept from her detective days. Latex gloves, small plastic bags, and a few basic tools. "Okay, boy," she said, clipping on his leash. "Show me what I missed." Rex led her straight to the same spot by the warehouse, his nose working the ground in determined circles. Lila knelt beside him, pulling on her gloves. The burnt fabric had been here. What else might she find? She began carefully clearing away loose dirt and debris. That's when she saw it, the glint of brass catching the weak morning light. Half buried in the packed earth was a spent bullet casing. Her hands trembled slightly as she photographed it and carefully extracted it from the dirt. 2 hours later, she sat in a cluttered basement lab across town. Dr. Elliot Hayes, a retired forensic analyst who'd helped her on countless cases before, examined the casing under his microscope. "This is interesting," he muttered, making notes. "The striations don't match the ballistics report from the Grayson murder at all." He looked up at Lila. "And it's definitely not from Ethan's service weapon either. Different caliber entirely." Lila's heart raced. This was it. The first real evidence that something wasn't right. "Could you document that officially?" "Already doing it," Hayes said, reaching for his camera. Back at her apartment, Lila spread out printouts of Grayson's final articles. The journalist had been working on a series of pieces about police corruption. Most were unfinished, but one name appeared repeatedly in his notes. Deputy Chief Vincent Drake. Grayson had been building a case against him, tracking suspicious financial transactions and unexplained promotions. Meanwhile, in his cell, Ethan watched Officer Maddox make his third pass of the morning. The guard's eyes lingered too long, his questions too specific. "Must be tough," Maddox said, pausing at Ethan's cell. Being a cop here, especially after such a high-profile case, Ethan kept his expression neutral. "Just doing my time. That appeal getting denied? Rough break. But maybe it's better to accept things, you know? Stop fighting what's coming." The words carried a weight that made Ethan's skin crawl. Maddox wasn't just a nosy guard, he was reporting to someone. Someone who wanted to make sure Ethan never left this place alive. In her dimly lit apartment, Lila reviewed her notes for the 10th time. The bullet casing was proof. Real, physical proof that could help reopen Ethan's case. But she needed more. The department wouldn't overturn a conviction on one piece of evidence, especially with so many powerful people invested in keeping Ethan behind bars. She was about to close her laptop when Rex suddenly lifted his head from his bed in the corner. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he stared at the front door. Lila froze, listening to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The shadow under Lila's door made her pulse quicken. She watched, frozen in place, as the handle moved ever so slightly. Rex remained beside her, his muscular body tense and alert, a continuous low growl rumbling from deep in his chest. The German Shepherd's eyes never left the door. Seconds stretched like hours until finally the shadow moved away. Lila counted to 30 in her head before approaching the peephole. The hallway beyond was empty, showing no sign of the mysterious visitor. Her hands shaking slightly, Lila did a thorough sweep of her apartment. Nothing seemed disturbed. All windows were locked, all rooms exactly as she'd left them. But the timing sent chills down her spine. She'd just found evidence that could help prove Ethan's innocence. And now this. "Come on, Rex," she whispered, gathering the evidence into her shoulder bag. "We need to go." 20 minutes later, she pulled up outside a modest apartment building in the city's journalism district. Caleb Reese's place was on the third floor, and he answered her knock with suspicious eyes that softened when he recognized her. "Detective Harper," he said, stepping aside to let her and Rex in. "This is unexpected." "I need your help," Lila said, pulling out the bullet casing and related documents. "It's about Miles Grayson's murder." Caleb's initial skepticism was clear on his face as she explained everything. Rex's behavior at the docks, finding the casing, and Dr. Hayes's analysis. But when he started going through Grayson's old notes, his expression changed dramatically. "Look at this," he said, pulling out a worn notebook. The night before he died, Miles wrote about meeting someone at the docks. He never specified who, but Caleb's finger traced the hastily scribbled words. He was convinced this meeting would break open his whole investigation into police corruption. "The case was closed before anyone could follow up on it," Lila said, the pieces starting to fit together. Meanwhile, in his Iron Hollow penitentiary cell, Ethan lifted his dinner tea jack from the slot and found a small piece of paper underneath. His blood ran cold as he read the message. "Stop asking questions. You're already dead." Back at Caleb's apartment, Lila gathered her things to leave. But as she approached her car in the racing lot, something caught her eye. A folded piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. With trembling fingers, she opened it and read the message that made her stomach drop. "Drop this or next time we won't knock." Lila sat at her Kit Hayes table, staring at the note under the harsh glow of her desk lamp. Rex lay at her feet, occasionally lifting his head to check on her. She hadn't even tried going to bed. Sleep felt impossible, with her mind racing through all the implications. The threat was precise, calculated. Someone had been watching her, tracking her movements. They knew about the evidence she'd found, about her visit to Caleb. This wasn't random harassment. This was a warning from people with resources in reach. When morning finally came, Lila's first move was to contact Ramon Ortiz. As one of West's trusted sources, the ex-con might have crucial information about what the journalist had uncovered before his death. Ortiz had agreed to meet, sounding nervous but willing on the phone. But when she pulled up to his rundown apartment building, her heart sank. The door to his unit stood wide open, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Drawing her weapon, Lila entered carefully. The apartment was destroyed. Furniture lay overturned, cushions slashed open, papers scattered everywhere. Every drawer had been yanked out and emptied onto the floor. Picture frames lay shattered, their contents torn to pieces. "Ramon?" she called out, but the silence told her everything she needed to know. Ortiz was gone. Following procedure, she called it in. Within minutes, other officers arrived, treating it like a routine break-in. One of them found Ortiz's phone smashed beyond repair in a dumpster behind the building. "Looks like your guys split town," her former colleague Elliot Hayes said with a shrug. "These ex-cons, they get spooked easy. Probably had some old debts catch up to them." But Lila knew better. This wasn't someone running. This was someone being silenced. Meanwhile, in the cold confines of the Iron Hollow Penitentiary, Ethan felt Officer Maddox's eyes on him constantly. The guard watched him during meals, during yard time, even lingering outside his cell more than necessary. "Something on your mind, Maddox?" Ethan finally asked during lunch. Tired of the surveillance, Maddox stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "There are people outside who don't want you leaving this place alive, Carver. Don't make it worse for yourself." Ethan kept his expression neutral, but inside his mind was racing. The warning confirmed what he'd suspected. His conviction wasn't just about punishment. Someone wanted him dead, and they were using the system to make it happen legally. Back in the city, Lila's phone buzzed with a call from Caleb. His voice was urgent, excited. "I checked security footage from the businesses near Ortiz's apartment," he said quickly. "You need to see this." Two men in masks dragged him into a black SUV at 3 a.m. He didn't run, Lila. They took him. The early morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Jerry's Diner, a worn-down establishment on the outskirts of town. Lila slid into a booth across from Caleb, who was already nursing his third cup of coffee. His eyes were red-rimmed from hours of reviewing security footage. "We're dealing with someone who knows how to work the system," Caleb said quietly, sliding a USB drive across the table. "This was nearly wiped clean, but I managed to recover some footage from the docks. Timestamp shows it was taken 2 hours before Grayson was killed. Lila plugged the drive into her laptop, and they huddled over the screen. The grainy footage showed a figure in what was clearly a police-issued jacket, dragging something heavy out of frame. The quality was poor, but one detail stood out crystal clear, a distinctive scar on the figure's left hand, visible in the harsh security light. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She'd seen that scar before, at countless department meetings and functions. Deputy Chief Vincent Drake had gotten it years ago, a knife wound that had never properly healed. "This could be what we need," she whispered, her hands shaking slightly as she ejected the drive. Meanwhile, in the Iron Hollow Penitentiary's general exercise area, Ethan was caught off guard. 3 inmates surrounded him, moving with practiced coordination. The first punch caught him in the kidney, dropping him to his knees. He managed to block the second attack, but the third inmate got him from behind. Ethan fought back hard, his police training kicking in. He landed several solid hits, but they had numbers on their side. Just as one of them pulled out a makeshift knife, Officer Maddox appeared, breaking up the fight with his baton. As the inmates scattered, Maddox leaned close to Ethan, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told you to stop asking questions." Then he walked away, leaving Ethan breathing heavily on the concrete floor, understanding dawning in his eyes. This wasn't random violence. It was orchestrated, a message delivered with fists and threats. Later that night, Lila was reviewing the footage again when a sharp knock echoed through her apartment. Rex immediately tensed, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Lila grabbed her service weapon, approaching the door cautiously. Through the peephole, she saw no one. Her heart pounding, she opened the door slowly, gun ready. There, on her welcome mat, sat a small cardboard box. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside, covered in dried blood, was Ethan's police badge. The sight of it made her stomach lurch. This wasn't just another warning, this was a declaration of war. Lila burst through Caleb's apartment door without knocking, her hands trembling as she held Ethan's bloodied badge. Caleb jumped up from his desk, scattering papers across the floor. "Someone inside the department left this at my door," she said, her voice tight with anger and fear. "This badge was logged into evidence. They're sending us a message." Caleb took the badge carefully, examining it under his desk lamp. "The blood's real," he said grimly. "And you're right, only someone with access to the evidence locker could have gotten this." Lila paced the small apartment, running her fingers through her hair. "We need to talk to Ethan. He might know something we don't." Using an old connection from her days in Vice, Lila managed to arrange a private visit to the Iron Hollow Penitentiary. The guards led her through a maze of stark corridors to a small interview room. When Ethan walked in, his orange jumpsuit bright against the G-Jack walls, his face hardened at the sight of her. "You shouldn't be here," he warned, his voice low and urgent. Lila leaned forward, keeping her voice steady. Rex found a bullet casing at the docks, different caliber than the murder weapon. Then Ramon Ortiz disappeared, grabbed by 2 men in an SUV. And there's footage, Ethan, security camera footage from the dock showing someone in a police jacket. Ethan listened intently, his jaw muscles working as she spoke. When she mentioned the distinctive scar on the figure's hand, his face went completely blank. "It was him," Ethan said finally, his words barely above a whisper. "Drake was the one who arrested me. He was first on the scene at Grayson's apartment." Ethan's hands clenched into fists on the table. If anyone could have planted evidence, it was him. The realization settled over them both like a heavy blanket. Ethan had been framed, and the person responsible was one of the most powerful men in the department. As Lila walked back to her car after the visit, her phone buzzed in her pocket. The message on the screen made her blood run cold. "This is your final warning. Next time, the dog dies first." She looked over at Rex sitting patiently in the passenger seat of her car. His tail wagged slightly at the sight of her, completely unaware of the threat. Lila's hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. They had just made this personal. Lila sat motionless in her car outside the Iron Hollow Penitentiary, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen of her phone. The threat was crystal clear. "This is your final warning. Next time, the dog dies first." Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel, rage and fear mixing in her chest. Rex whined softly from the passenger seat, sensing her distress. This wasn't just about proving Ethan's innocence anymore. Now they were threatening her partner. Without hesitation, she started the car and drove straight to the outskirts of town, where her old mentor lived. Detective Jack Thornton's house was small but well-maintained, with security cameras mounted discreetly at every corner. He answered the door before she could knock, his weathered face creased with concern. "You look like hell, kid," Jack said, ushering her and Rex inside. In his cluttered living room, Lila laid out everything. The bullet casing Rex had found, Ortiz's disappearance, the security footage showing someone with Drake's distinctive scar. Jack listened silently, occasionally taking notes in a small notebook. When she finished, Jack leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "You're about to go to war with people who don't lose, Lila. Drake's got friends in every precinct, every courthouse. He's untouchable." "No one's untouchable," Lila replied firmly. "I need you to dig into his past. There has to be something, anything we can use to expose him." Meanwhile, in the Iron Hollow Penitentiary, guards escorted Ethan through dimly lit corridors to a different cell block. The official reason was security concerns, but Ethan knew better. His new cell was smaller, darker, and came with an unexpected surprise: a cellmate. Victor Shaw sat on the bottom bunk, his Iron Hollow Penitentiary, pale skin, marked with faded tattoos. Ethan recognized him immediately, a former cop from Drake's unit, convicted of murder 3 years ago. As soon as the guards left, Shaw stood up slowly, moving close to Ethan. His breath was hot against Ethan's ear as he whispered, "You're not getting out of here alive." Back at Jack's house, Lila gathered her notes, preparing to leave. She checked her phone one last time and froze. A new message had arrived with an attachment. When she opened it, her stomach dropped. It was a photo of her apartment door, taken from just outside, the peephole centered in the frame like a bullseye. Lila's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she raced home, her mind racing faster than the car. Rex sat rigid in the passenger seat, his ears twitching at every sound, picking up on her fear. The German Shepherd's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by an alertness that made the hair on the back of Lila's neck stand up. She raced across the street from her apartment building, scanning the area carefully. Nothing seemed out of place. No suspicious vehicles, no lurking figures. But that photo of her door meant someone had been here recently. "Stay close," she whispered to Rex as they made their way inside. Drawing her gun, Lila methodically cleared each room of her apartment. The living room was untouched. The bedroom looked exactly as she'd left it. But when she reached the kit haze, her breath caught in her throat. There on her wooden table sat a manila envelope that definitely hadn't been there before. With gloved hands, she carefully opened it. Crime scene photos spilled out. Stark, brutal images from Miles Grayson's murder scene. Her stomach churned as she recognized details that had never been released to the public. The exact position of Grayson's body, the angle of the gunshot wound, even the scattered papers around his desk. Among the photos was a simple white note card. The message was typed in plain black letters. "Stop digging or you'll end up just like him." Lila's mind raced. These photos came from the official case file. Files that only someone with police clearance could access. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Someone inside the department was watching her every move. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and called Caleb. "Meet me at the Red Pine Motel outside the city," she said quietly. "Room 115. And Caleb, make sure you're not followed." The Red Pine Motel was exactly the kind of place people went to disappear. Peeling paint, flickering neon sign, and not a security camera in sight. Perfect for their needs. Lila arrived first, checking in under a false name, while Rex kept watch. Caleb showed up 20 minutes later, his laptop bag clutched tightly to his chest. His eyes were wide with excitement despite the late hour. "I got into the police personnel files," he said as soon as the door closed behind him. "Drake's records, something's off. His travel logs for the night Grayson was killed don't match his official reports. He claimed he was at a conference in Springfield, but his vehicle GPS puts him right here in the city." Lila spread the crime scene photos across the bed. "These were left in my apartment. Someone's trying to scare us off." They began connecting the dots, laying out everything they knew about Grayson's murder, Drake's involvement, and Ethan's frame-up. Rex lay near the door, seemingly relaxed but alert. Suddenly, the dog's body went rigid, his ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Before either Lila or Caleb could react, the motel window exploded inward with a deafening crack of gunfire. Glass shattered across the motel room as Lila and Caleb dropped to the floor. Rex's powerful bark filled the small space, his body tensed and ready to protect. Another shot ripped through the wooden door, sending splinters flying. Lila's police training kicked in. She rolled behind the bed, gun drawn, and fired 2 quick shots through the broken window. But whoever had attacked them was already gone, leaving only the sound of screeching tires in the distance. "Are you hit?" Lila called out to Caleb, who had taken cover behind the bathroom doorframe. "No, I'm okay," he said, his voice shaking. "But we need to get out of here." They grabbed their evidence and ran to Lila's car, Rex leading the way, scanning for threats. The night air was thick with tension as they sped away from the motel, taking back roads to avoid being followed. "I know somewhere we can go," Lila said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Jack has a cabin in the woods. It's off the grid. No one else knows about it." As they drove through the darkness, Caleb pulled out his laptop. "I found something else while digging through records," he said, his voice steadier now. Drake made a wire transfer to a Cayman Islands account 3 days after Grayson was murdered. $200,000, no explanation. Lila's jaw tightened. Money to keep someone quiet? While they made their escape, Ethan faced his own battle inside the Iron Hollow penitentiary walls. Victor Shaw, his new cellmate, attacked during yard time. It looked like a regular Iron Hollow penitentiary fight to the guards watching, but Ethan knew better. Shaw's moves were too precise, too practiced. Ethan managed to block a sharp jab aimed at his throat, countering with a defensive strike that sent Shaw stumbling backward. Guards rushed in to break up the fight, but the message was clear. Someone wanted Ethan dead before he could expose the truth. The cabin appeared as a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. When Lila finally pulled up the narrow dirt road, Rex jumped out first, circling the perimeter as Lila and Caleb carried their equipment inside. The wooden structure was small but secure, hidden by thick trees on all sides. Lila allowed herself to relax slightly, running a hand through her hair as she looked around the rustic interior. This would be safe. This would give them time too. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. The message made her blood run cold. "Nice try, detective, but we always know where to find you." She rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness between the trees. Somewhere in those shadows, hidden eyes were watching. The cabin creaked and groaned throughout the night as wind whistled through the surrounding trees. Lila sat in an old armchair, her gun within reach, watching shadows dance across the walls. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made her muscles tense. Rex hadn't left her side, his warm body pressed against her legs, ears perking up at each sound from outside. Caleb hunched over his laptop at the Kit Hayes table, the blue glow of the screen illuminating his tired face. He'd been working nonstop since dawn, diving deep into Miles Grayson's digital footprint. Cups of cold coffee littered the table around him. "Lila," he called out suddenly, his voice cutting through the morning quiet. "I found something." She moved to look over his shoulder. On the screen was a folder simply labeled Insurance, locked behind several layers of encryption. "Can you crack it?" she asked. Caleb's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Give me time." Hours ticked by. Rex paced the cabin while Lila sorted through their existing evidence. Finally, Caleb let out a triumphant sound. "I'm in," he said, opening the folder. "Look at this. Grayson's personal notes from the week before he died." Lila leaned closer, reading the hastily scrawled words. Her heart began to race as the pieces fell into place. Grayson had arranged a meeting with someone inside the department, someone who knew what Drake was doing. The meeting location made her stomach drop, the docks right where Rex had found that bullet casing. "He never made it to that meeting," Lila said quietly, because whoever he was supposed to meet ended up dead instead. Meanwhile, in the sterile confines of the Iron Hollow Penitentiary visiting room, Ethan sat across from Jack Thornton. The retired detective looked older than Ethan remembered, worry lines etched deeply in his face. "I've been making calls," Jack said in a low voice, glancing at the guard by the door, pulling every favor I have left. But Ethan, ... He leaned forward, his expression grim. "There's no appeal coming. They're pushing your execution date up, fast-tracking it." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He'd known they wanted him silenced. But this was different. They weren't just trying to keep him locked away. They wanted him dead, and they wanted it done quickly. Back at the cabin, Lila spread Grayson's notes across the table, the truth finally crystallizing in her mind. Grayson had been about to expose everything about Drake. Someone inside the department, someone with power and influence, had made sure that never happened. Now those same people were methodically eliminating everyone who might uncover their secret. She looked at the evidence before her, the bullet casing, Grayson's notes, the wire transfer records. Her jaw set with determination as she grabbed her car keys. They were running out of time. She had to act now. Ethan sat on his thin iron hollow penitentiary cot, his heart hammering against his ribs as Jack's warning echoed in his mind. "They're fast-tracking your execution." The words felt like a physical blow. No more appeals, no delays, just days left to live. His fingers gripped the edge of the cot until his knuckles turned white. The reality of his situation crashed over him like an icy wave. There was only one option left now, one he'd been avoiding since his arrival. He'd have to break out. That night, Ethan lay awake, studying the guards' movements through his cell door. He'd spent months memorizing their patterns. Who took smoke breaks? Who arrived late? Which corners of the block had blind spots? But Troy Maddox remained the biggest obstacle. The corrupt guard watched him like a hawk, always hovering nearby, always ready to report back to whoever was pulling the strings. While Ethan planned his escape across town, Lila and Caleb hunched over West's notes in the dim light of the cabin. Caleb pointed to a recurring mention in the journalist's writings. Just 2 letters, JB. "Look here," Caleb said, scrolling through department records on his laptop. West kept meeting this JB person, but never wrote down the full name. Lila leaned closer, her eyes scanning the screen as Caleb searched through personnel files. Suddenly he straightened. "Got something. Nathan Lane, retired officer, served 20 years in the department." They wasted no time racing to Lane's last known address, a small house on the outskirts of town. But as they approached, Lila's hand instinctively moved to her gun. The front door stood ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. Inside, chaos greeted them. Papers littered the floor, drawers hung open, and furniture lay overturned. Signs of a violent struggle were everywhere. A broken lamp, a knocked-over bookshelf, scattered photos, but Lane himself was nowhere to be found. Back at the Iron Hollow Penitentiary, fate handed Ethan his opportunity. The sound of shouting erupted from another cell block, followed by the crash of breaking glass. A riot had broken out. Ethan watched as guards rushed past his cell, heading toward the commotion. Even Maddox turned to look. In that moment of distraction, Ethan struck. He slammed his food T-Jack into Maddox's head as the guard passed too close to his cell, dropping him instantly. Ethan's fingers fumbled for the key card on Maddox's belt, yanking it free. His heart pounding, Ethan swiped the card through his cell door's reader. The lock clicked open. He had minutes, maybe less, before they realized he was gone. It was now or never. Lila moved carefully through Lane's ransacked apartment, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Papers crunched under her feet as she examined the walls, looking for anything the intruders might have missed. Caleb searched the desk, sifting through scattered documents. Something caught Lila's eye, a slight discoloration in the wall paint near the baseboard. She knelt down, running her fingers along the surface until she felt it, a tiny seam. Using her pocket knife, she carefully pried at the edge until a small panel popped open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a single flash drive. "Caleb," she called softly, "I need you to look at this." They huddled around Caleb's laptop as he worked to decrypt the drive's contents. After several tense minutes, audio files appeared on the screen. Caleb clicked the first one, and Miles Grayson's voice filled the room. "Detective Lane, can you tell me again about what you saw in Drake's task force?" The recording continued, revealing Lane's trembling voice. The smuggling operation. It wasn't just drugs. Drake was moving weapons too, using police resources, our own evidence lockup. I couldn't stay quiet. More recordings played, each one more damning than the last. Lane detailed how he'd gathered evidence against Drake, how he'd reached out to Grayson as a last resort. But the most chilling revelation came near the end. Drake knows, Lane's voice whispered. He called me into his office yesterday, told me to take early retirement, or they'd retire me permanently. Meanwhile, at the Iron Hollow Penitentiary, Ethan pressed himself against the wall of the exercise yard, heart pounding. The guard tower's spotlight swept past him as he inched toward the outer fence. Just 20 more feet. 15. 10. The night air suddenly filled with the piercing wail of alarms. Ethan's escape had been discovered. Shouts erupted from the guard tower as flashlight beams began dancing across the yard. He had seconds before they found him. Back at Lane's apartment, Lila clicked on the final recording. Grayson and Lane's voices were hushed, urgent. "There's someone else," Grayson said. "Someone who helped set up Carver." "Yeah," Lane replied. "A cop. Someone Drake trusted to handle the dirty work." "Who?" "Detective Jack Thornton. He planted the evidence, made sure Carver took the fall." Lila's blood ran cold as the recording ended. Jack, her mentor, the man she trusted, had helped frame Ethan all along. Lila's hands shook as she stared at the laptop screen, her world tilting on its axis. Jack Thornton, the man who taught her everything she knew about being a detective, who guided her through her rookie years, was part of this conspiracy. "It can't be right," she whispered, but Caleb was already pulling up bank records on his screen. "Look at these deposits," he said, pointing to several large transactions, all from offshore accounts, all within days of Grayson's murder. Jack's financial records show he was struggling before this. Mortgage behind, medical bills piling up. Then suddenly he's flush with cash. Lila felt sick. The evidence was right there, but her mind refused to accept it. She pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over Jack's number. After a deep breath, she pressed call. "Meet me at O'Malley's," she said when he answered. "We need to talk." The bar was nearly empty when Jack walked in, his weathered face creased with its usual calm expression. He slid into the booth across from Lila, ordering a whiskey neat from the passing waitress. Lila didn't speak. Instead, she took the flash drive from her pocket and placed it on the table between them. Jack's eyes fixed on it, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for Lila to see the crack in his facade. "I never wanted you involved in this, kid," he said, his voice cold and measured. All pretense of the warm mentor was gone. "You should have left it alone. Did you help frame Ethan?" Lila's voice cracked slightly. Jack's shoulders sagged. "Yes," he admitted. "Drake had things on me. Things that would have destroyed everything. My career, my family, all of it. He just wanted Wes silenced. The murder ... He shook his head. That wasn't part of the plan." Meanwhile, across town, Ethan Carver scaled the Iron Hollow Penitentiary's perimeter fence, his heart pounding in his ears. Gunshots cracked through the night air, missing him by inches. He reached the top and threw himself over, landing hard on the other side. Pain exploded through his shoulder. Dislocated, he realized, through the haze of agony. But he couldn't stop. He made it 3 steps before bright headlights blinded him. A black SUV appeared from nowhere, tires screeching as it stopped directly in his path. The back door flew open and hands reached for him, yanking him inside before he could react. Back at O'Malley's, Jack leaned across the table, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You have no idea how deep this goes." His hand moved slowly, deliberately, and Lila tensed. But instead of drawing a weapon, he slid a gun across the table toward her. "You have one chance to walk away, Lila," he said quietly. "Do it." On the other side, Ethan thrashed against the iron grip of 2 men holding him down in the SUV's back seat. His dislocated shoulders screamed in protest, but he kept fighting until cold metal pressed into his ribs. "You really should have stayed put, Carver," one of the men growled, jamming the gun harder against his side. The SUV wound through empty streets, finally pulling up to a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of town. The men dragged Ethan inside, his feet scraping against concrete. The musty air smelled of rust and decay. A figure emerged from the shadows, Vincent Drake, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the rundown surroundings. He looked down at Ethan with cold disdain, like someone examining an unwelcome pest. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Drake's voice echoed in the empty space. Meanwhile, across town at O'Malley's bar, Lila's hand closed around the gun Jack had slid across the table. In one fluid motion, she lifted it and aimed it directly at her former mentor's chest. "You're going to help me take Drake down," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Jack leaned back, a hint of pride flickering across his weathered features. "You really are just like Ethan," he said softly. Back at the warehouse, Drake circled Ethan like a shark, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor. He stopped directly in front of Ethan, crouching down to meet his eyes. "I don't care what your little detective friend finds," Drake said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You won't live long enough to see her fix this." Ethan's muscles tensed as he assessed his situation. Two men holding him, Drake in front, probably more guards outside. His shoulder was useless, but he still had a chance. A small one, but it was now or never. If he didn't make his move right now, this warehouse would become his grave. He gathered his strength, preparing to fight. Ethan sat bound to a metal chair in the center of the warehouse, blood trickling down his temple, where one of Drake's men had struck him. The copper taste in his mouth reminded him this was real, no nightmare he could wake up from. Dim light filtered through grimy windows high above, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Across from him, Vincent Drake lounged against a wooden crate, swirling amber liquid in a crystal tumbler. His expensive suit looked out of place in the decrepit building, but his eyes held the same coldness as the space around them. "You should have just accepted your fate, Carver," Drake said, taking a measured sip of whiskey. "Now you've made this messy." Ethan worked his wrists against the rope, feeling for any give. His shoulder throbbed from the earlier dislocation, but he pushed the pain aside, focusing instead on his surroundings. 4 guards stationed around the room, their weapons visible. A heavy metal door stood locked at the far end. His gaze caught on a length of pipe lying just a few feet away. If he could loosen these bindings enough. Drake's overconfidence was evident in his relaxed posture. In the way he savored his drink, like this was just another business meeting, he thought he'd won. But Ethan had survived worse odds before. Across town, Lila and Jack huddled over a laptop, where Caleb had traced an encrypted text from Drake. The signal pointed to an abandoned warehouse district on the outskirts. "He won't stop at Ethan," Jack said, his voice gruff. "Drake will keep killing until there's no one left who knows the truth, including me." He watched as Lila checked her weapon and strapped on her vest. "I'm going in," she said, her jaw set with determination. Jack stared at her for a long moment before cursing under his breath. He grabbed his own gun from the desk drawer, checking the magazine. "Damn it, kid. Let's go save your idiot partner." Back in the warehouse, Ethan felt the rope give slightly around his wrists. His heart quickened, but he kept his expression neutral as Drake approached, leaning down until their faces were inches apart. "Your execution is still happening, Carver," Drake said, his breath reeking of expensive whiskey. "Just not in the way you expected." The guards moved toward Ethan, their boots scraping against concrete. But this time, Ethan wasn't helpless. This time, he was ready. Ethan's muscles tensed as he felt the rope finally give way. In one fluid motion, he snapped his hands free and lunged for the metal pipe lying nearby. The cold steel felt solid in his grip as he swung hard, connecting with the first guard's knee. A sickening crack echoed through the warehouse, followed by the guard's howl of pain as he crumpled to the ground. The second guard fumbled for his weapon, but Ethan was faster. He kicked the nearby table with all his strength, sending it crashing into the guard. The gun went skittering across the concrete floor. Ethan dove for it, his fingers almost brushing the grip when the third guard slammed into him from behind. They hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from Ethan's lungs. The guard's fist connected with his jaw, stars exploding behind his eyes. Ethan fought back, landing a solid punch to the man's ribs. They rolled across the floor, trading brutal blows. Through the chaos, Drake remained eerily calm. He set down his whiskey glass with deliberate care, and walked unhurried to the exit. The heavy steel door closed behind him with a definitive click of the lock. He had no intention of getting his hands dirty. That's what his men were for. Outside the warehouse, Lila and Jack moved silently through the shadows. They found 2 perimeter guards by the back entrance, quickly subduing them with precise strikes. Neither Lila nor Jack spoke. Their mutual distrust hung between them like a wall. But right now, Ethan's life mattered more than their suspicions. Inside, Ethan grappled with the last standing guard. His body ached from the fight, but adrenaline kept him moving. They crashed into a stack of rusted machinery, metal parts scattering across the floor. Ethan's hand found a jagged piece of scrap metal. Without hesitation, he drove it into his attacker's side. The guard gasped and stumbled backward, clutching the wound before collapsing. Breathing heavily, Ethan staggered to his feet. He limped to the locked door and kicked it with everything he had left. The door burst open, and there stood Drake, his gun aimed squarely at Ethan's head. Before Drake could squeeze the trigger, a shot cracked through the air. Drake jerked backward, blood blooming on his sleeve as the bullet tore through his arm. He stumbled, his face contorting in pain and shock. Lila and Jack stood in the warehouse entrance, their weapons trained steadily on Drake. "Hands where I can see them, Drake," Lila commanded, her voice as cold as steel. Drake's laughter echoed through the warehouse, dark and unsettling, despite the blood soaking his sleeve. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous light as he sneered at them. "You really think you can stop this?" He shook his head, almost amused. "You have no proof." Lila stepped forward, her gun never wavering from his chest. "Actually, we do." Jack's hand moved smoothly as he tossed a small black device onto the concrete floor. The recorder clattered between them, its red light blinking steadily. It had captured everything since they entered the warehouse. Every threat, every admission. "It's over," Ethan said, moving to stand beside Lila. His voice was steady, certain, but Drake's smile didn't fade. In one fluid motion, he reached behind his back and pulled out a concealed knife. The blade glinted in the dim light as he lunged at Lila. She squeezed the trigger, but Drake was faster than they expected. He knocked her gun aside, the knife slashing across her side. Lila stumbled backward with a sharp gasp, pressing her hand against the spreading red stain on her shirt. Ethan didn't hesitate. He charged forward, ramming into Drake with his full weight. They crashed together, trading vicious blows. Drake fought like a cornered animal, all precision lost to desperate fury. With a sudden twist, Drake gained the upper hand. He slammed Ethan against a metal beam, pinning him there. The knife rose high, ready for a killing stroke. That's when Rex struck. The dog burst through the warehouse entrance like a furious shadow, launching himself at Drake. His powerful jaws clamped down on Drake's wrist, drawing a scream of pain from the man. The knife clattered to the floor as Rex's teeth dug deeper. Jack moved swiftly, snatching up Lila's fallen gun. He aimed it at Drake's head, his expression grim. "You're done, Vincent." Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Lila had managed to call it in before they'd entered the warehouse. As the sound of approaching backup filled the air, Drake's face twisted into a bitter smile. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed through clenched teeth. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Lila and Ethan's eyes met across the warehouse floor, both knowing this victory might only be the beginning. The arrest of Vincent Drake should have been the end, but something felt off. Evidence started disappearing from the police archives. First, the original ballistics report, then key witness statements. Someone was still working behind the scenes, trying to bury the truth. 3 more files went missing this morning, Caleb said, his fingers flying across his keyboard. "They're getting sloppy, though." I managed to back everything up. The process of clearing Ethan's name dragged on. The department, embarrassed by the scandal, tried to handle things quietly. But Lila and Caleb had other plans. They compiled everything, the recordings, the missing evidence, Drake's operation, and sent it to every major news outlet in the city. The story exploded. Headlines screamed about police corruption and cover-ups. The public demanded answers, and for once, the department couldn't sweep it under the rug. Ethan's exoneration came through on a Tuesday morning. The same afternoon, Jack Thornton showed up at Lila's apartment. He looked tired, older somehow. "I'm leaving town," he said simply. "Too many people want me dead now." He glanced between Lila and Ethan, who had been reviewing case files at her Kit Hayes table. Rex watched him warily from his spot by Ethan's feet. "I never thought you two would actually pull this off," Jack admitted, shaking his head. Ethan's voice was cold when he responded, "You're lucky we didn't kill you." Jack's mouth twisted into a knowing smirk. Without another word, he turned and walked away into the darkness. Lila and Ethan stood on her balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The media frenzy was already dying down, replaced by newer scandals and fresher outrage. Life moved on. Weeks passed. The beach was quiet except for the gentle lap of waves. Ethan sat in the sand, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on his face. Rex dozed beside him, occasionally twitching in his sleep. The sound of footsteps in the sand made him look up. Lila approached, 2 beers in hand. She tossed one his way and settled down next to him. "So what now?" she asked, looking out at the orange-streaked horizon. Ethan took a long drink before answering. "We keep going." Rex let out a contented sigh between them as the sun dipped lower. For the first time in years, Ethan took a deep, free breath. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of Lila's office as she pored over financial records spread across her desk. Most people believed the case was closed. Vincent Drake was behind bars, awaiting trial in a maximum security Iron Hollow penitentiary. But something didn't sit right with her. Rex lay at her feet, occasionally lifting his head when she muttered to herself. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed a series of wire transfers from an offshore account that should have been frozen weeks ago. "This is impossible," she whispered, reaching for her phone to call Ethan. Within an hour, Ethan and Caleb were in her office, examining the evidence. Caleb's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard as he traced the money trail. "These transfers," Caleb said, pointing to his screen, "they're being routed through shell companies, but they all lead to one place: Riverdale Maximum Security Iron Hollow Penitentiary." Ethan leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "The warden?" "Nathan Cole," Lila confirmed, pulling up his file. "He's been there for 15 years, spotless record, but these numbers don't lie. He's received over $500,000 in the past month alone." They dug deeper, Caleb hacking into encrypted emails while Lila and Ethan called their remaining trusted contacts inside the Iron Hollow penitentiary system. The picture that emerged was chilling. Drake had effectively turned his cell into a command center, with Cole ensuring he had everything he needed to continue operating. Their suspicions were confirmed when the news broke. Guard Gavin Hayes was found dead in Drake's cell block. Hayes had been a key witness in the case against Drake, his testimony crucial to the conviction. "This isn't a coincidence," Ethan said, pacing Lila's office. Hayes was about to testify again at the federal trial. Lila's phone rang, displaying an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, putting it on speaker. "Detective Harper," a familiar voice drawled. "Drake, I've been expecting your call." Lila's hand tightened around the phone. "How did you get this number?" Drake's laugh echoed through the speaker. "I told you, Detective. You think this is over? I'm just getting started." The line went dead, leaving them in stunned silence. Rex growled softly, sensing the tension in the room. The federal prosecutor, Sophie Hayes, leaned back in her chair, studying the evidence spread across her desk. Ethan and Lila had spent the last hour making their case, explaining how Drake was still operating his network from inside Iron Hollow Penitentiary. "We need him in complete isolation," Ethan insisted. "No visitors, no phone calls, no contact with other inmates." Hayes shook her head. "Without concrete proof of ongoing criminal activity, I can't justify that level of restriction. The Iron Hollow Penitentiary Board won't approve it." Just then, Lila's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Reese, 20 minutes. Come alone." She recognized Jack's cryptic style immediately. "I need to handle something," she said, standing up. "Ethan, finish briefing Ms. Hayes." At the Reese, Jack waited in the shadows of an old oak tree. He looked different, thinner, with G-jacking stubble and tired eyes. "Drake's planning something big," he said without preamble. "He's arranged an escape during his upcoming transfer to federal custody." Lila's pulse quickened. "How do you know? I still have contacts. His people are going to hit the transport van. They've got everything planned. Routes, timing, backup plans. It's happening next week. Back at Lila's apartment, she and Ethan formulated their counterplan. Rex lay between them, ears perking up whenever they mentioned Drake's name. We feed false information through Jack, Ethan suggested. Make them think the transfer is happening a day early. When they show up, we'll be waiting, Lila finished, with SWAT and FBI backup. They spent the next few days setting everything in motion. Jack played his part perfectly, feeding Drake's people the wrong date. Through their Iron Hollow penitentiary contacts, they confirmed Drake had taken the bait. He was practically gloating about his imminent freedom. "There's one more thing we need," Lila said, looking down at Rex. The dog stared back, alert and ready. "He's found more evidence than most detectives. We bring him with us." Ethan nodded, remembering how Rex had led them to crucial evidence before. "He's earned it." They positioned SWAT teams along the false transport route, with FBI agents hidden at strategic points. Lila and Ethan took their positions with Rex, waiting in an unmarked car near where Drake's men would likely strike. Through their earpieces, they heard the all-clear signals from various teams. Everything was in place. Now they just had to wait for Drake's people to spring their trap, not realizing they were the ones being trapped. Rex suddenly stiffened in the back seat, his ears forward. Lila checked her watch, right on schedule. In the distance, they could see several black SUVs approaching slowly. "All units hold position," Ethan whispered into his radio. "Let them make the first move." The SUVs spread out across the road, clearly preparing to box in what they thought would be the Iron Hollow penitentiary transport. Armed men emerged from the vehicles, weapons ready. Now, Lila breathed into her radio. Suddenly, floodlights blazed to life, illuminating the entire area. SWAT teams emerged from their hiding spots. FBI agents moved in from all sides. Rex let out a deep growl as the night erupted into chaos. The night exploded into chaos as floodlights flooded the area. SWAT teams converged from all directions, their commands echoing through the darkness. Drake's men, caught off guard, returned fire desperately. The air crackled with gunshots and shouts. Vincent Nolan, Drake's right-hand man, went down first. 2 clean shots from a SWAT sniper left him sprawled on the asphalt. But as the dust settled and the shooting stopped, something was wrong. Drake wasn't among the captured men. "He's not here," Lila called out to Ethan, her voice tight with frustration. He knew. Somehow he knew. Ethan scanned the area, his jaw clenched. "Split up. He has to be close." They moved through the compound methodically, checking every shadow and corner. Rex padded alongside Lila, nose to the ground. Suddenly, the dog's head snapped up, his ears perked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Rex darted forward, leading them to what looked like an old maintenance shed. Inside, hidden beneath some rotting floorboards, they found a tunnel entrance. "Clever," Ethan muttered, drawing his weapon. The tunnel was narrow, barely lit by emergency lights that cast everything in an eerie red glow. They hadn't gone far when they heard it. Footsteps ahead. Then Drake's voice echoed off the concrete walls. "You've been a real pain, Detective." He emerged from the shadows, gun trained on them. A smirk played across his face. "But let's end this, shall we?" Ethan moved fast, knocking the gun from Drake's hand before he could fire. The 2 men crashed into each other, fists flying. Drake landed a heavy blow to Ethan's ribs, making him stumble. Ethan recovered, countering with a sharp jab to Drake's jaw. Blood jacked as Drake's elbow connected with Ethan's nose. The former deputy chief was stronger, his Iron Hollow penitentiary workouts evident in his powerful strikes. He caught Ethan with an uppercut that sent him reeling back against the tunnel wall. Drake advanced, ready to finish it, but he'd forgotten about Rex. The dog launched himself forward, powerful jaws clamping down on Drake's arm. Drake screamed, trying to shake the dog loose, but Rex held firm. Ethan seized his chance. He pushed off the wall and threw everything he had into one final punch. His fist connected with Drake's temple, and the man crumpled to the ground. Lila rushed forward with handcuffs, securing them tightly around Drake's wrists. "Vincent Drake," she said, unable to keep the satisfaction from her voice. "Under arrest." They marched him out of the tunnel, where FBI agents were waiting. This time there would be no deals, no chances for escape. His network was exposed, his allies captured or turned. As the agents led him to a waiting vehicle, Ethan, Lila, and Rex stood together. watching the man who had nearly destroyed their lives being taken away for good. Rex sat between them, his tail wagging contentedly. His mission, their mission, was finally complete. Weeks passed like a gentle tide, washing away the remnants of their ordeal. Ethan stood in the police chief's office, watching as his record was officially cleared. The chief slid Ethan's badge across the desk, its surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Welcome back, Detective Carver," the chief said, but Ethan shook his head. "I'm done with the badge," he told Lila later as they walked through the Reese. Rex trotted ahead of them, his tail wagging freely. "I just want to live." Lila understood. She faced her own crossroads at the department. The brass had dangled a promotion in front of her, detective sergeant, her own team, a corner office, a hefty pay bump. But after years of watching the system protect itself, the offer felt empty. One morning, she stepped into the chief's office and placed her resignation on the desk. The choice felt right, like finally surfacing for air after being underwater too long. She rented a modest downtown office, just 2 rooms and a waiting area, nothing extravagant. The sign on the door read, "Harper Investigations." Caleb was her first hire, bringing his sharp tech skills and keen investigative instincts. When Ethan arrived one morning with coffee, she didn't even need to ask. He just sat down, grabbed a case file, and got to work. Together, they built something different, something real. Their first case took down a corrupt judge. The second exposed an embezzlement ring, siphoning funds from a local charity. With every victory, their reputation grew. People knew they wouldn't stop digging until they uncovered the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. Rex finally got the retirement he had earned. No more late-night stakeouts or chasing suspects. Now his days were filled with long walks, endless games of fetch and belly rubs. The old police dog seemed happier, his eyes bright and playful. One warm evening, Ethan and Lila sat on the beach, watching Rex dart after seagulls along the shore. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and pink, and the beers in their hands had gone pleasantly warm. Lila nudged Ethan with her shoulder. "You ever gonna settle down?" Ethan took a slow sip of his beer, a smirk tugging at his lips. Maybe. Lila arched a brow, teasing. Ethan watched as Rex splashed through the shallow waves, barking at the water as it surged around him. His grin widened, genuine in a way she hadn't seen in years. "We'll see." They sat in easy silence as the sun dipped lower, draping everything in golden light. For the first time in years, the future stretched before them like an open road, boundless, theirs to claim. The tale of a wrongfully convicted cop, his unwavering dog, and their relentless fight to unearth the truth wraps up in a moment that hits you right in the heart. From those breathless seconds in a frigid iron hollow penitentiary, where life and death hung by a thread, to the steadfast paws of a dog cutting through the shadows of Bet Jackal. This journey has been an emotional roller coaster you won't soon forget. Sacrifice, loyalty, and the burning thirst for justice came together to paint a picture of the power of belief, even when the world turns its back. As the sun dips low over the beach, where they sit gazing at the horizon, it sinks in that sometimes victory isn't just about surviving, it's about reclaiming who you are from the wreckage of lies. If this story gripped you, if those jaw-dropping twists set your pulse racing, and the courage of these unyielding characters left you inspired, then show me some love by hitting that subscribe button on my YouTube channel below. Every day I bring you thrilling tales, unsolved mysteries, and journeys that keep you glued to the screen. Make sure to ring that bell so you never miss a single video. Join me as we dive deeper into the hidden corners of this world. Are you ready? Subscribe now, and let's step into the next story together.